WellLink Health Alliance are one of the driving forces behind anti-opioid policies. If you've gone to the hospital recently and they refuse to give you painkillers and gave you Tylenol instead, these guys might be a big part of the reason why. Your reminder that Tylenol isn't a painkiller and doesn't perform any better than placebos for pain. These comments are part of their NEO Opioid Education Series, The Future of Pain Management, Cutting-Edge Non-Opioid Solutions. This series is supported by the CDC's Overdose Data to Action Grant. Your tax dollars at work. Shout out to the Doctor-Patient Forum for cluing me in on this one. I'll link to their Patreon in the show notes. This clip features Dawn Harris, Senior Medical Science Liaison at Vertex Pharmaceuticals. Yeah, they're basically in bed with Vertex. They're listed as a corporate sponsor, and the slides are copyright 2025 Vertex Pharmaceuticals Incorporated. By the way, Vertex has patented the non-opioid painkiller Journavx. Journavx, or suzetrigine, is a novel new class of painkiller that works on sodium channels. It can be effective for moderate acute pain when compared to placebo, and works almost as well as the weaker opioids such as hydrocodone. It's not a replacement for anything stronger. And it's not approved for chronic pain, and phase 2 trials so far haven't separated it from placebo. Harris said in the presentation,
"Despite very good current controls from the CDC, there still is abuse of prescription opioids. It still does result in opioid-related mortality."
Oh yes, it's all about the prescriptions. Let's just ignore the black market, where the real deaths are occurring.
According to CDC reports, overdose deaths from prescription opioids have remained consistent since 2010, despite a 50% decrease in opioid dispensing from clinicians.
Wait a minute. Prescriptions dropped in half, but prescription opioid deaths have remained constant? That ain't the flex you think it is, Harris. In fact, since 2010, opioid deaths have risen dramatically. Of course, that's when you include the illicitly manufactured variety. Anyway, nice of them to acknowledge that none of this worked and that prescription opioids aren't the driving force behind overdoses. All the misery, all the forced tapers, all the pharmacy refusals, all the arrests, all the civil suits, all the untreated pain, all the denial of care, all the suicides, and it was all for nothing. Thanks for going on record with that. Of course, they're taking the usual position of the authoritarian. It didn't work, so we need to do more of it. But I haven't even gotten to the really bad part yet.
Another important note to mention as well, in another clinical study among opioid users who transitioned to heroin or fentanyl, 83% stated that they started with medically prescribed opioids.
That is an outright lie. The paper they're talking about is the effects of opioid policy changes on transitions from prescription opioids to heroin, fentanyl, and injection drug use, a qualitative analysis, published in the July 2022 edition of the journal Substance Abuse Treatment Prevention and Policy. Okay, first lie. It's not a clinical study. From the study's methods section, we conducted 148 in-depth interviews with people who use prescription opioids non-medically, fentanyl or heroin, from a rural, urban, and suburban area in 3 states, Connecticut, Kentucky, and Wisconsin. Interviews with people who use opioids focused on how they initiated their opioid use and any transitions they made from PO use to heroin, fentanyl, or injection drug use. So first off, that's not a clinical study. That's interviews. It also wasn't about people who were prescribed opioids. It was specifically about people who used them non-medically. Now, remember her claim.
83% stated that they started with medically prescribed opioids.
Yeah, no they didn't. Of the 148 participants, 134 said they started with some form of prescription opioid, regardless of whether or not it was prescribed. Of those 134, 111 later transitioned to heroin, fentanyl, or both. But only 64 said that the opioids they initially used had been prescribed to them by a doctor. That's 43%, not 83%. Also, by implication, she's making out like the study followed a representative group of pain patients and found that a whole bunch of them became addicts. No. As I pointed out, they started out looking specifically for non-medical users. They then asked them to backtrack and reconstruct their opioid histories. But even at that, those 64 aren't even established to have initially used them medically or as directed instead of starting out abusing them, or even if that was their purpose in seeking them out. All you had is a prescription being at the beginning of a long and complex opioid history out of people who were specifically selected as non-medical users without any sort of causation established. But listen to what the paper actually found. As more policies were passed to limit opioid prescribing, participants noticed that doctors were less likely to prescribe or refill POs. This led to scarcity of POs on the street, which accelerated the switch to heroin or fentanyl. These transitions likely increased risk of overdose and HIV/HCV infection. In other words, people who were already getting prescription opioids on the black market saw their supplies cut, so they had to switch to the illicit forms. In fact, the study concluded, a careful analysis of how and why people say they transition from PO to heroin or fentanyl reveals many unintended harms of policy changes to prevent overprescribing and diversion. Results highlight the importance of mitigating harms that resulted from policy changes. The exact opposite of what Harris claimed. And to make matters even worse, they're continuing to push this very same policy that resulted in these incredible harms to begin with. All at the behest of a pharmaceutical company trying to market a non-opioid pain medication that doesn't even work that well. This is lying, this is gaslighting, and this is absolutely a violation of every bit of medical ethics that exists.